Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Just a heads up, there are a few ads between the 5 and 15-minute mark, then it's completely ad-free after that. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax or drift off to sleep. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe you won't find stories quite like these anywhere else. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The mountains of the East Coast had always held a different kind of magic compared to the rugged, dry peaks of the West. My teacher, a man who spent every summer break lost in the wilderness, told us this story from a time when he and his closest friends were at the peak of their hiking obsession. They were the type of people who lived for the climb, seeking out the most challenging routes across the United States. On this particular trip, they had decided to leave the familiar trails behind and head east to tackle a legendary route known for its dense forests and isolated paths. They were experienced, well-equipped, and confident, perhaps a bit too confident, as they pulled their dusty SUV into the small gravel parking lot at the base of the trailhead. As they adjusted their heavy packs and checked their gear one last time, they noticed several flyers and handwritten signs pinned to the wooden bulletin board near the entrance. Some of the signs were official, while others looked like they had been put up by concerned locals. They mentioned a mysterious individual seen on the trails and gave a strange detail about a hiker wearing bright pink running shoes. At the time, my teacher and his friends just glanced at them and shared a quick laugh. They figured it was probably just some eccentric local or a city person who had come out into the woods with the wrong footwear. They didn't give it a second thought as their minds were focused on the grueling 8-hour ascent they had planned for the day. The first few hours were exactly what they had hoped for. The air was cool and thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. They climbed steadily, their boots crunching on the fallen leaves and smooth stones. By the time they reached the 7-hour mark, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, thin shadows through the ancient trees. They were exhausted but satisfied, having covered a significant amount of ground. They found a small, flat clearing that looked like a perfect spot to spend the night. It was tucked away from the main path and offered a bit of shelter from the wind. While his two friends started the methodical process of pitching the tents and organizing the cooking gear, they realized they were low on water. They told my teacher to head down to a nearby creek they had passed a few minutes earlier to fill up their containers. He grabbed the large water buckets and began the short walk down the slope. The forest was starting to go quiet as the birds settled in for the night, leaving only the sound of his own footsteps and the distant gurgle of the water. When he reached the creek, the air felt noticeably colder. He knelt on a mossy rock and submerged the first bucket, watching the clear water swirl inside. Just as he was about to reach for the second bucket, he heard a distinct rustle in the thick bushes on the opposite bank. It wasn't the sound of a small animal or the wind. It was the sound of something heavy moving through the undergrowth. He froze, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. He looked up and scanned the greenery, expecting to see a deer or maybe even a black bear. What he saw instead was far more unsettling. Slowly, a face emerged from the deep shadows of the leaves. It was a man with a wild, matted beard that hung down to his chest, covered in dirt and bits of forest debris. The man wasn't moving or making a sound. He was simply standing there, half hidden, staring directly at my teacher with an intensity that felt predatory. There was no greeting, no wave, and no expression of surprise. It was just a cold, unwavering gaze. Panic flared in my teacher's chest. Without thinking, he dropped the bucket he was holding and scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the wet rocks. He didn't look back until he had sprinted all the way back up the hill and burst into the campsite, breathless and pale. His friends looked up from their work, startled by his sudden appearance. When he managed to catch his breath and tell them about the man in the bushes, they didn't react the way he expected. They were seasoned outdoorsmen who had seen plenty of strange things on the trail, and they immediately began to poke fun at him. They joked that he had probably seen a reflection or a harmless old hermit who lived in the woods. They laughed it off, telling him he was just tired from the long hike and that his imagination was playing tricks on him in the fading light. Despite their teasing, an uneasy feeling settled over the camp. The sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, and the forest was swallowed by a deep, heavy darkness that felt much more oppressive than usual. About an hour later, the three of them were sitting closely around the small campfire they had built. The fire provided a small circle of orange light, but beyond that, the woods were a wall of blackness. They were eating their dinner and trying to relax when a sound suddenly cut through the silence. It was the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps hitting the ground. Someone was running, and they were running fast. Before any of them could even stand up, a figure burst into the light of the fire. It was the bearded man from the creek. He didn't stop or slow down. He ran with a terrifying, focused energy directly through the center of their campsite, leaping over their gear and passing just inches away from where they sat. In those few seconds of frantic motion, the firelight illuminated his features perfectly. He was tall, thin, and moved with a strange, frantic grace. But the detail that chilled them to the bone was what he was wearing on his feet. Just as the signs at the trailhead had warned, the man was wearing a pair of bright, neon pink running shoes that looked completely out of place against his ragged clothes and the rugged terrain. He vanished into the darkness on the other side of the camp as quickly as he had appeared, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance until there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. The laughter and the teasing stopped instantly. The reality of the situation hit them all at once. This wasn't just a strange hiker. This was something dangerous. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to every snap of a twig and every rustle of the leaves. The fear was no longer just my teachers. It was shared by all of them. They realized they couldn't stay there. They were miles from help, and a clearly unstable person was circling them in the dark. They made a quick, hushed decision to abandon the rest of their trip. They packed their gear as quietly and as fast as they could, their hands shaking as they stuffed sleeping bags into sacks. With their headlamps turned to the highest setting, they began the long, treacherous hike back down the mountain in the middle of the night. Every shadow looked like a crouching figure, and every sound felt like a footstep following them. They didn't stop to rest, pushed forward by pure adrenaline. By the time the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, they finally reached the base of the mountain. Exhausted and terrified, they saw the small ranger station near the parking lot and headed straight for it. A couple of rangers were already inside, starting their morning shift, when my teacher and his friends burst through the door and began frantically explaining what had happened. The man at the creek, the pink shoes, and the way he had charged through their camp. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The rangers didn't laugh, and they didn't look skeptical. Instead, their faces went pale, and they exchanged a look of sheer alarm. One of the rangers immediately picked up a radio and began calling for backup, while the other sat the group down and asked for every specific detail they could remember. They were told to stay put and were informed that a team of Army Rangers was being mobilized to search the area. The Rangers then asked them a question that made their blood run cold. Would they be willing to hike back up the mountain with the military team to point out the exact location of the encounter? They agreed, though the thought of going back into those woods filled them with dread. As they waited for the reinforcements to arrive, they finally asked what was going on and why everyone was reacting with such intensity. The truth was far worse than anything they had imagined. The rangers explained that over the past several months, several hikers had gone missing in that specific area of the forest. Some had never been found, while others had been discovered weeks later, having been the victims of a violent and calculated killer. One of the most recent victims was a woman whose body had been found a few miles from where the group had set up their camp. When her body was recovered, the authorities noticed a strange and disturbing detail. Her high-end, bright pink hiking shoes were missing. The police and the Park Service had been searching for the suspect for a long time. But the man seemed to know the forest better than anyone, disappearing like a ghost every time they got close. The group realized with a jolt of horror that the man they had seen was not just a strange local. He was wearing the trophy of a woman he had murdered, and he had been watching them from the shadows, waiting for his moment. He had likely been tracking them since they first stepped onto the trail. The way he had run through their camp was perhaps a taunt or a way to see how they would react before he made a more aggressive move. If they hadn't decided to leave in the middle of the night, they might have become the next missing person posters on the trailhead bulletin board. Later that morning, they led the team of heavily armed Army Rangers back up the trail. The woods felt different now, stripped of their beauty and filled with a sense of lurking evil. They reached the campsite and the creek where my teacher had first seen the man. The military team searched the surrounding area with expert precision, looking for tracks, hidden shelters, or any sign of where the man might have gone. They found some disturbed earth and a few faint footprints that matched the tread of a running shoe, but the man himself was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had sensed the change in the air the moment they returned with professional help. He had retreated deeper into the vast, unforgiving wilderness where he lived, moving through the brush without leaving a trace. My teacher and his friends finally left the mountains that day, driving away as fast as they could. They never went back to that part of the country again. For years afterward, my teacher said he couldn't look at a pair of pink shoes without feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. The experience changed the way he viewed the outdoors. He realized that while the mountains and the forests were beautiful, the most dangerous thing you could encounter in the wild wasn't a storm or a wild animal. It was the person you didn't see standing right behind the leaves, watching and waiting in the silence. The mystery of the man in the pink shoes remained a dark legend in that area, a reminder that some predators don't belong to the animal kingdom, and some warnings should never be ignored. The memory of that man's eyes at the creek stayed with him for the rest of his life. He often wondered what would have happened if he hadn't run back to camp that moment, or if his friends hadn't agreed to leave in the dark. The forest has a way of swallowing secrets, and that man was one of them. Even now, when he tells the story, he does so with a sense of gravity that makes everyone in the room go quiet. It serves as a haunting lesson that the world is much larger and more unpredictable than we like to think, and that sometimes the stories people tell about mysterious figures in the woods are based on a reality that is far more terrifying than any fiction. When I was 10, I regularly attended a choir club for kids. It was one of the few parts of my week that felt simple and safe. Singing with other kids, following the rhythm, trying to remember lyrics, laughing when someone messed up. It was ordinary in the best way. I never worried about how I would get home afterward, because it was always my mom who picked me up. That was just how things were, predictable, routine, normal. So when my dad was the one waiting for me that day, it confused me. I remember walking out of the building, spotting his car, and feeling that small flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't fear at first, just confusion. I remember thinking maybe my mom was busy or sick or running late. Kids accept changes easily when they don't yet understand how much meaning they can carry. I got into the car. At first, the drive felt quiet but not alarming. My dad didn't talk much, but that wasn't unusual. He wasn't a big talker anyway. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, still trying to figure out why he was the one driving me home. Halfway through the drive, something changed. My dad started mumbling. At first, I couldn't understand what he was saying. His words were low, broken, like he was talking more to himself than to me. I leaned forward a little in my seat, trying to listen. Then I caught a few phrases that made my stomach twist. He said he was sorry. He said I would never see him again. At 10 years old, those words don't make sense right away. They sound dramatic, strange, unreal. I remember laughing nervously at first, asking what he meant, telling him to stop being weird. But he didn't answer. He just kept driving, with eyes fixed on the road, voice cracking as he repeated how sorry he was. I asked again, and again. My voice was getting higher, more desperate. Fear was starting to creep in, slow and cold. I could feel it in my chest, like something tightening around my heart. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't normal. He still wouldn't explain. The rest of the drive felt endless. Every familiar street suddenly felt wrong. I remember thinking about my mom, about my little brother, about how quiet everything felt. When we finally reached our apartment building, I felt a rush of relief, like whatever this was would stop once we got home. But it didn't. My dad parked the car and didn't get out. He just sat there. Then he told me to leave the car. I hesitated. I asked him again what he meant. I asked him why he was saying these things. I remember my hands shaking, my throat tight, tears already starting to burn in my eyes. That's when he finally said it. He told me I would not see him again because he would be dead very soon for what he did. He said the police would answer my questions. I didn't fully understand the words, but I understood the tone. I understood that something terrible had happened, something irreversible. He pushed me to get out of the car, impatient now, urgent, like he needed me gone. I got out, the door closed, and the car drove away. I stood there for a second, frozen, my brain trying to catch up with my body. Then panic hit all at once. I ran toward our apartment, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I remember fumbling with the door, expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door was open. That alone was wrong. My mom always locked the door. Always. Even during the day. Even if she was just stepping out for a moment. Seeing it open made my chest tighten even more. I stepped inside. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I called out for my mom. No answer. I called out for my little brother. Nothing. My voice sounded small and strange in the empty space. Then I saw it. A puddle of blood on the floor. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Blood was something I had only ever seen in movies or from scraped knees. This was different. Darker, still, wrong. That's when the police arrived. I don't remember exactly how they came in or who spoke first. I just remember uniforms, voices, and someone gently guiding me outside. They spoke softly to me, telling me I was safe now, asking me if I was hurt. Then they explained what had happened. My dad had attacked my mom. He was obsessively jealous, controlling, paranoid. He had found a pack of old condoms in a cupboard and decided that this meant my mom had cheated on him. He ignored the obvious facts. That we had recently moved into the apartment. That the condoms could have been left by previous tenants. That there was no real evidence at all. In his mind, none of that mattered. He had already decided. The police told me he had smashed her skull in with a full wine bottle. Even now, writing those words feels unreal. At 10 years old, I couldn't imagine what that meant. I couldn't picture it. I just knew it was bad. Very bad. The kind of bad that changes everything. The only reason my mom survived was because my little brother intervened. My brother was 7 years old. He had witnessed our dad attacking our mom. He had seen something no child should ever see. Somehow, despite his fear, despite his size, despite being just a child, he intervened. He distracted him. He gave my mum the chance she needed to survive. If he hadn't been there, the police told me, my dad would have killed her. That truth settled into me slowly, like poison spreading through my thoughts. My little brother saved our mum's life. My little brother carried that weight before he even understood what it meant. The police took me to the hospital. The ride felt endless. I remember staring at my hands, noticing how small they looked, how dirty they were. I remember the smell of the car, the sound of the siren, the way everything felt unreal, like I was floating above my own body. At the hospital, I saw my mum. She was alive. That was the first thing that mattered. She was hurt badly, bandaged, bruised, weak, but alive. When I saw her, I finally broke down. Everything I had been holding in exploded at once. I cried harder than I ever had before or since. My little brother was there too. He looked different, older somehow, quieter, smaller and heavier at the same time. We didn't talk much, we didn't know how. We just existed in the same space, both of us trying to understand what had happened to our family in the span of a single afternoon. When my dad said I would not see him again, he meant he planned to kill himself after dropping me off. That knowledge hit later like an aftershock. He didn't succeed. The police found him in time and had him committed to a mental ward. He didn't die that day, but the person I knew as my father did. Whatever relationship existed before that moment was gone forever. That day is still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. Not because of the blood or the police or even the violence itself, but because of how suddenly everything shattered. One moment I was singing in a choir. The next, my family was broken in a way that could never be fully repaired. The trauma didn't end there. My brother and I both suffered extreme mental trauma later in life because of that event. Nightmares, anxiety, fear, a constant sense of waiting for something bad to happen. We carried it differently, but we both carried it deeply. Sometimes I think about my brother more than anyone else. I think about what it meant for him to see his own father beating his mother nearly to death, to step in, knowing he could be hurt or killed. To carry that memory into adulthood. That kind of experience doesn't leave you, it reshapes you. Somehow we both turned into decent people. That feels almost miraculous when I think about it. We grew up in the aftermath of violence, fear, and control. Yet we didn't become cruel. We didn't become numb. We learned empathy the hardest way possible. I never really told my brother how grateful I am that he was there. I never told him how often I think about what he did, how many times I've replayed that moment in my head, knowing that without him, our mum would be gone, knowing that our lives would have ended in a completely different way. I think I really, really should tell him. There are some words that feel too heavy to say, especially when they carry so much emotion, but gratitude like that deserves to be spoken. He deserves to know how much he mattered, how much he still matters. Despite everything my mum went through, she is the most cheerful and sweetest woman I have ever known. That is something I will never stop being amazed by. She survived an abusive marriage. She survived a near-fatal attack. She survived betrayal, fear, and unimaginable pain. And somehow she chose to keep living her life with kindness. Not fake happiness, not denial, real strength. She raised 2 children alone. She protected us. She loved us. She built a life from the wreckage of what happened. She didn't let bitterness consume her. She didn't let hate define her. It takes real strength to do that. I didn't understand it as a child. I understand it now. That day taught me things I wish I had never had to learn so early. That love can coexist with control. That jealousy can turn lethal. That danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people you're supposed to trust the most. it also taught me something else. That survival is possible, even after the worst moments of your life. That people can endure unimaginable trauma and still choose kindness. That children can be braver than anyone should ever have to be. That gratitude matters even years later. This happened a long time ago, but it still lives with me. In small ways, in quiet thoughts, in moments where I catch myself checking locks twice, or listening too closely to raised voices, or feeling fear when things feel too calm. But it also lives with me in the form of love. Love for my mom. Love for my brother. Love for the life we managed to build after everything tried to destroy it. And maybe someday soon, I'll finally tell my brother what I should have said a long time ago, that he saved our family and that I will always be grateful. About 10 years ago, I had one of the most intense and surreal experiences of my life, something that still sits heavy in my chest whenever I think about it. At the time, I was driving with a close friend across a long dam in southern Idaho. The dam stretched for about 2 miles, straight and exposed, with water on both sides and very little room to pull over safely. It was a place locals used often. People came there to swim, fish, run, or just enjoy the view. Because of that, seeing someone jogging along the road didn't immediately feel strange. As we drove, I noticed a woman ahead of us, running along the side of the road. What caught my attention was that she was jogging on the side that barely had any shoulder at all. Cars passed through there at decent speeds, and it didn't feel safe for someone to be running so close to traffic. At first, I just thought she might not have realized how dangerous that side was, or maybe she planned to cross over later. But as we got closer, something felt wrong. I could see that she was crying, not just wiping away tears, but fully crying, her body tense and frantic. I instinctively slowed the car down. Before I could even process what was happening, she suddenly turned and jumped directly in front of my car. She hit the hood hard and started screaming at me to stop. Everything happened so fast that my mind struggled to catch up. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding, completely shocked. Before I could even ask what was going on, she ran to the passenger side and yanked the door open. She climbed into the car without hesitation. I was driving an old 1990 Mazda at the time, a low car with only 2 doors and very little space inside. She squeezed herself onto the passenger seat, on top of my friend, panicked and desperate, yelling at me to drive. Her voice was shaking, full of fear, and I didn't question it. I just drove. As I pulled away, both my friend and I asked her if she was okay and what we could do to help. That's when I noticed her shirt. It was white, but large patches of it were stained with blood. The sight made my stomach drop. She was shaking, breathing fast, clearly trying to calm herself down. After a moment, she managed to explain what had happened. She told us she had just jumped out of a moving car because her boyfriend was beating her. She said he had their kids with him. Hearing that felt unreal. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road while my thoughts raced. We asked her where she needed to go or if she wanted to call anyone. She told us to take her to the closest town, which was about 15 minutes away. We kept driving, every second feeling tense and fragile, like anything could go wrong at any moment. When we reached the end of the dam, she asked to move into the back seat so she could make some phone calls. We stopped briefly so she could climb back there, and then I started driving again. Just as we pulled away, she suddenly shouted in panic. She said he had turned around. I looked into the rearview mirror and my heart dropped. Behind us, I saw a car racing across the dam, moving fast, far too fast. It was the same car she had jumped out of. The distance between us was closing quickly. I pressed harder on the gas, hoping to put space between us and get away. But the dam was long and open, and there was nowhere to hide. Within moments, he was right on our tail. We were heading up a fairly large hill at this point, and my speed climbed higher than I was comfortable with. Still, he kept up. Then he tried to pass me on the hill, even though oncoming traffic was coming downhill toward us. He swerved back behind me at the last second, narrowly avoiding a collision, only to floor it again once we reached the top. By then, we were probably going over 80 miles per hour. My hands were shaking, my heart felt like it was going to explode, and I was terrified of causing an accident that could hurt innocent people. Suddenly, he pulled in front of me and slammed on his brakes. I barely had time to react. I swerved off the road slightly, losing control for a moment before coming to a stop. Everything went silent for a split second, then chaos exploded. He jumped out of his car, screaming and pointing at the woman in the back seat, demanding she come get her kids. His voice was full of rage. She started crying again, panicking, torn between fear and desperation. Before we could stop her, she opened the door and got out. We asked her if she was okay, if she needed us to stay, but she told us to leave. She begged us not to call the police. She ran to the other car and opened the back door, wrapping her arms around her children, holding them tightly like she was afraid they might disappear. Even from where I sat, I could feel the weight of that moment. The man turned toward us, screaming for us to drive off. She looked back and motioned for us to go too. We didn't know what else to do. We were scared, shaken, and overwhelmed. I drove away, my entire body trembling. Neither my friend nor I spoke for a while. We were both trying to process what had just happened, unsure if we had done the right thing, unsure what we should do next. After driving about a mile, we pulled into a local farmhouse. I needed to stop. I needed to breathe. We went inside and called the police. We gave our statements describing everything we had seen, the cars, the people, the direction they went. The officer listened carefully and thanked us. But after that day, we never heard anything else. We don't know if they were able to locate the car. We don't know what happened to that woman or her children. That uncertainty has stayed with me ever since. The entire experience felt unreal, like something out of a movie, except it was painfully real. I still think about that woman, about the fear in her eyes, about the blood on her shirt, about the way she clung to her children when she finally reached them. I think about how close things came to going horribly wrong, not just for her, but for everyone on that road. More than anything, it broke my heart. It made domestic violence feel real in a way it never had before. It wasn't a story on the news or something happening to someone far away. It was right there in front of me, pulling itself into my car and turning my world upside down in a matter of minutes. Even now, years later, I carry that moment with me. It reminds me how dangerous and complicated these situations can be, how fear can trap people, and how sometimes there are no clear right choices. I still hope, quietly, that she and her children found safety. And I still feel that ache in my chest whenever I think about how close we all came to something far worse. My friend once told me a story about a woman he knew, a close friend who loved backpacking more than anything. She wasn't the type who got scared easily. She had been hiking for years, and the wilderness felt like home to her. So when she decided she wanted to thru-hike the entire Appalachian Trail alone, nobody was really surprised. They were nervous for her, sure, but they also knew she was strong, smart, and experienced. She believed that if she stayed careful, trusted her instincts, and stuck to the shelters, the trail would treat her well. She started her journey with excitement. Those first few days were full of new faces, shared meals in wooden shelters, and long conversations with people who were chasing the same dream as she was. There's a special kind of friendship that forms on trails like that. Strangers become hiking buddies, and hiking buddies feel like a temporary family. She loved that feeling. Every time she settled down for the night in a shelter filled with tired, muddy hikers, she felt safe. She felt like she belonged. During the day, she walked with people she met along the way. Some hikers were older, some younger, some fast, some slow. They all had different stories, but they shared the same simple goal: keep walking north. She rarely ever felt alone. Even when the woods were quiet, she knew someone was always a few miles ahead or behind. She wasn't worried about safety, not really. The Appalachian Trail community is known for being kind, but after a while she started craving something different. She wanted to experience the trail the way she had imagined it before starting. Peaceful, quiet, just her, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. So one morning, she decided she would hike alone for a while. She told her trail friends she'd meet them again at a shelter in a few days, and she set off early before anyone else woke up. At first, it felt beautiful. The forest felt bigger, calmer. Without conversation, she noticed details she hadn't paid attention to before: how the sunlight moved across the trail, how the birds reacted when someone approached, how her footsteps sounded on the dirt and leaves. She loved the feeling of being small and surrounded by nature. But after a couple of hours, she started noticing something strange. Every now and then, when she stopped to take a sip of water or tie her boot, she saw someone far behind her on the trail. It was a man, just one man, hiking alone. Nothing unusual, she told herself. People hike solo all the time. She didn't think much of it at first. She'd see him for a moment, then keep walking. But as the day went on, she realized this man never got closer. He never tried to pass her, never spoke, never waved, never even looked at her long enough for her to feel acknowledged. Every time she stopped, she'd see him far back on the trail, just standing there or taking a step forward before disappearing around a bend. Something about it bothered her, though she kept telling herself not to overthink things. The next day was the same. She hiked alone, enjoying the quiet. But that man appeared again, always behind her, always at a distance, always slow enough to stay out of reach. She tried to shake the feeling of unease. Maybe he was shy. Maybe he just walked slowly. Maybe he had no idea she was noticing him. But something deep inside her kept whispering that something wasn't right. On the third day, when she woke up early and left her campsite, she checked the trail behind her. He wasn't there. She walked for miles without seeing him. She felt relieved, but also strangely alert, like her body was waiting for him to appear again. That afternoon, she reached the shelter where she had planned to meet her friends. Seeing familiar faces made her chest loosen in a way she didn't realize she needed. She didn't tell them about the man. She didn't want to sound paranoid. They continued hiking together for the next few weeks. She didn't see the stranger again. Eventually, the group finished the entire Appalachian Trail. She reached Katahdin, the final mountain, and celebrated with the people who had become her temporary family. People asked her if she had ever felt unsafe being a woman hiking alone. She always said no. Nothing bad had happened. At least, that's what she believed at the time. When she got home, she unpacked slowly, going through all her gear and all the small things she had collected along the way. One of the things she'd been meaning to do was develop the film from the disposable cameras she carried. The cameras held hundreds of memories. The first shelter, mountain views, trail friends, sunsets, strange mushrooms she found on the forest floor. So she took the rolls to the photo store, handed them over, and forgot about them for a few days. When the photos were ready, she picked them up, excited. As soon as she got home, she sat down and started going through them. There were pictures from the very beginning. The Springer Mountain trailhead, her first tired smile, some blurry photos from her first rainy day. As she kept flipping, she saw shots of the peaks she summited, laughing with friends, and small moments she had forgotten she captured. flowers, wildlife, a waterfall she loved. Every picture pulled her back into the trail. She felt warm and nostalgic. But then she reached a photo that made her freeze. She was in the picture, but she wasn't awake. She was sleeping. It was a shot of her lying in her sleeping bag, tucked into her tent. The angle was wrong for it to be a selfie. Someone had been inside her camp. Someone had stood close enough to her to take a clear picture of her sleeping face. Her first thought was that she must have let a friend borrow her camera. Maybe someone had taken a silly picture as a joke. But as she looked at the next few photos, her stomach tightened. After a couple normal trail photos, there was another picture of her asleep, then another. Different days, different campsites, different angles. Someone had been visiting her camp multiple nights in a row. She checked the timestamps. The photos were taken on the exact days she had been hiking alone. The same days she kept seeing that man behind her on the trail. The same days she had felt watched but ignored it because she didn't want to overreact. The reality hit her in waves. That man had been following her, not harmlessly, not innocently. He had been approaching her campsite at night, opening her tent or crouching near her shelter, close enough to touch her, close enough to watch her breathe, close enough to take pictures without waking her up. She stared at those photos for a long time, her skin cold, shaking at the thought of how close she had come to something much worse. She had slept through it. She had never known. She realized how lucky she had been to survive that part of the trail. She had hiked hundreds of miles after that, without knowing someone had been stalking her, photographing her, maybe waiting for the right moment to do something far worse. She never found out who the man was. She never reported it because it was too late by then. No proof except photographs of moments she wished she never knew about. All she could do was accept the truth that the trail had held a danger she hadn't seen. And even though she still loved hiking, she never again felt the same peace camping alone in the woods. Because once you know someone stood over you while you slept, more than once, the darkness of the forest no longer feels quiet. It feels alive, aware of you, watching. And if you've ever hiked alone, especially in long stretches of silent woods, you probably felt a chill just thinking about it. One summer during high school, I worked as a receptionist at a small IT company in Atlanta. It wasn't a big operation at all. There were only about 6 employees, and the office had that quiet, slightly cluttered feel that small businesses often have. Most of the company's income came from providing personal IT support for small to mid-sized companies in the Atlanta area. They handled things like setting up networks, fixing computers, and maintaining systems for businesses that couldn't afford full-time IT staff. Every once in a while, though, the company would take on jobs outside the city. These were usually delivery and installation jobs for specialized systems. When that happened, one of the technicians would have to travel several hours away, sometimes into rural areas, to get the work done. One of the technicians who often handled these travel jobs was a man I'll call M. M was a black man in his 40s, friendly, polite, and easy to talk to. He had one of those personalities that made people feel comfortable right away. He was also a family man, with 2 young daughters he talked about often. This was around 2007 or 2008, before smartphones and GPS apps became something everyone depended on without thinking. Back then, getting directions wasn't as simple as typing an address into your phone and following a calm voice telling you when to turn. M relied on an old paper map that he kept folded in his car. It was worn from use, the creases softened over time, but it had always gotten him where he needed to go. On one particular job, M was sent to a site somewhere in the North Georgia mountains. The area was far from Atlanta, and the roads became narrower and more winding the farther he drove. Tall trees lined the sides of the road, and cell service was spotty at best. After a while, M realized he might have missed a turn. The landmarks on the map didn't seem to match what he was seeing anymore. Not wanting to keep guessing, he pulled into a small gas station along the road. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, with old pumps and a small building that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Outside, he saw an elderly white woman standing with her adult daughter. They looked harmless enough, friendly even. M approached them and politely asked if they could help him with directions. He explained where he was trying to go and showed them his map. The two women smiled and told him they knew exactly where he needed to be. They seemed confident, familiar with the area. To be helpful, they wrote out detailed directions on a piece of paper, explaining which roads to take and what to look for along the way. M thanked them, got back into his car, and continued on his journey, trusting that they had pointed him in the right direction. At first, everything seemed fine. He followed their instructions carefully, turning when they said to turn and staying on the roads they described. But after some time passed, he started to feel uneasy. According to the directions, he should have reached his destination by now. Instead, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The surroundings became more isolated. Houses disappeared. The pavement eventually gave way to a dirt road, uneven and dusty, cutting through thick woods. The deeper he went, the more his instincts started to warn him that something wasn't right. M pulled over to the side of the road to check his map again. He wanted to be sure before going any farther. While he was stopped, he also opened his glove compartment. Inside was his handgun. It was legally owned and licensed, something he carried only for emergencies. He hadn't needed it before, but something about this situation made him want to be prepared. After looking at the map and the directions again, M decided it was best to turn around. Whatever was ahead didn't feel safe, and he didn't want to push his luck. He shifted the car into gear, turned it around, and started heading back the way he came. He didn't get far. As the car moved forward, he suddenly saw figures blocking the road ahead. At first, his mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. There were dozens of people standing across the dirt road, completely blocking his path. As he got closer, the details became horrifyingly clear. There were around 50 people, all dressed in white robes with pointed hoods. One of them was holding a torch, its flame flickering against the dark backdrop of the trees. The scene looked like something pulled straight from history books or old black and white photographs, not something that should have existed in modern America. M immediately understood what was happening. The directions he had been given were not a mistake. The elderly woman and her daughter had intentionally sent him there. They had contacted their husbands, sons, friends, and others, letting them know that a lone black man was lost in the mountains and would be driving straight toward them. What M had stumbled into was a modern gathering of the Ku Klux Klan. The group surrounded his car quickly. They shouted racial slurs and insults, pounding on the sides of the vehicle. Hands hit the windows. The car rocked back and forth under their force. The dirt road echoed with their voices, filled with hate and excitement. Inside the car, M stayed calm. He had served in the military, and that experience had taught him how to control fear under pressure. Panic wouldn't help him here. He assessed the situation carefully, knowing that any wrong move could cost him his life. He reached for his handgun. Slowly and deliberately, he tapped the gun against the window so that it was visible. He didn't wave it wildly or make sudden movements. He waited until enough of the people noticed what he was doing. When their attention shifted to the weapon, he raised it and pointed it directly at the closest person. The effect was immediate. The crowd scattered. People backed away quickly, fear replacing the confidence they had shown moments earlier. None of them wanted to be shot. The shouting stopped, replaced by chaos as they moved out of the way. M didn't hesitate. He slammed the accelerator and sped away, kicking up dust as he escaped down the road. He didn't slow down until he was far away from the area, his heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened settled in. He made it back safely. When he returned to the office and told us what had happened, the room went silent. It was difficult to process that something so openly hateful and dangerous could happen so recently, not in some distant past, but in our own time, in our own state. What stayed with me most was the thought of how close M had come to being seriously harmed or killed. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a man trying to do his job, trusting two strangers who appeared kind and helpful. The fact that their friendliness masked such cruelty was deeply unsettling. I consider myself a liberal and have strong opinions about gun control. I believe in regulation and responsibility, and I don't take the topic lightly. But even now, years later, I sometimes think about that day and wonder what would have happened if M hadn't been carrying his handgun. He was a father to two young girls. He had a family waiting for him at home. Without that weapon, without his training and calm under pressure, the outcome could have been far worse. That story changed the way I see certain things. It forced me to confront uncomfortable realities about hate, danger, and how quickly trust can be weaponized. It also reminded me that the world isn't always as safe or progressed as we like to believe, and that sometimes survival depends on being prepared for the worst, even when you least expect it. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. Daniel Morcombe was only 13 years old when he left his house one ordinary day, doing something so simple and familiar that no one could have imagined what was about to happen. He walked down to a bus stop, planning to catch the bus to the shops so he could buy Christmas presents for his family. It was that time of year when everything feels busy but hopeful, when kids are thinking about holidays, gifts, and time off school. Daniel was doing exactly what thousands of children do every day, trusting the world around him to be safe enough for a short trip on his own. He never made it to the shops. Instead, a car pulled up and 3 men abducted him in broad daylight. There were people around. Multiple witnesses saw Daniel being grabbed. Some saw him struggling. Some heard raised voices, but no one intervened. Everyone assumed that someone else would step in, that surely another adult would act, that it wasn't their responsibility. This is what people later called the bystander effect. But at the time, it was just a series of seconds where no one moved quickly enough. Daniel disappeared that day, and his absence became a wound that never closed. For 8 long years, his parents searched for him. 8 years of living in a state of suspended reality, not knowing if their son was alive or dead, not knowing where he was, not knowing what had happened to him. They never stopped looking. They went to prisons and spoke to inmates, listening to rumors and horrifying stories about what people claimed had been done to their child. They heard things no parent should ever have to hear, and they had no way of knowing whether any of it was true. They lived with constant uncertainty, clinging to hope, while being slowly crushed by it at the same time. For 8 years, there were no answers, just missing posters, memorials, and questions that haunted an entire community. Then finally, a tip came in. It led to the arrest of one of the men responsible, a man who, disturbingly, had 4 children of his own. He refused to give up the names of his accomplices, protecting them even after everything he had done. But he did tell police what happened to Daniel. What he said was almost impossible to comprehend. According to his confession, there was no motive like money or revenge. There was no reason that made sense in any human way. They simply wanted to know what it was like to kill a child. When they saw Daniel, they decided to take the opportunity. They abducted him, drove him out to a forest, and walked him deeper inside. They cut off his ear. Then they killed him. His remains were left there, hidden in the bush, where they would not be found for years. When Daniel's remains were eventually discovered, it brought answers, but it did not bring peace. What makes this story even harder to process is how close it hit to home for me personally. It wasn't something that happened in a distant place to people I'd never met. It was woven directly into my own life. I had been born in the same town where the man who killed Daniel lived. Later, I moved to the state and the exact area where Daniel had lived, where he was abducted, and where he was murdered. These weren't abstract locations on a map. They were familiar streets, familiar landmarks, places I passed regularly. I met Daniel's parents multiple times, both before and after his remains were found. They were kind, broken, resilient people who carried unimaginable grief with a quiet strength that was painful to witness. I saw them trying to live, trying to honor their son, trying to survive a loss that should never exist. I attended Daniel's funeral. I watched his twin brother carry his coffin. That image is something that never leaves you. Seeing a child carry the weight of his twin's death in such a literal way is almost unbearable. It felt wrong, like the world itself had broken its own rules. I had camped in the forest where Daniel's remains were found long before I knew what had happened there. At the time, it was just another place, another patch of bush. Later, knowing what had occurred there, the memory took on a completely different weight. The idea that such horrific violence could happen in a place that once felt peaceful and ordinary was deeply unsettling. It changed how I saw the landscape around me. It made everything feel less safe, less innocent. One of the hardest things to come to grips with was how this tragedy played out in front of me over and over again in everyday life. Every time I was driven to school, I was forced to confront it. At the end of my street was the motel where those men had stayed. We passed it without comment, but I knew what it represented. Then we passed Daniel's memorial at the bus stop, a quiet reminder of a life taken and a child who never came home. And then we passed the forest just off the road where his remains had been found. All of it lined up along a single route, like a cruel timeline that replayed itself every day. It was impossible to escape. As a child and then as a teenager, I struggled to understand how something so senseless could happen. How three people could look at a child and decide to end his life out of curiosity. How a normal day could turn into a nightmare in seconds. How a community could be filled with witnesses, yet no one could stop it in time. It shattered any illusion that bad things only happen for reasons, or that the world is fundamentally fair. Daniel's story changed the way I understood evil. It wasn't dramatic or obvious at first. It didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in the form of a car pulling up at a bus stop, in a moment where people hesitated instead of acting. It showed how fragile safety really is and how easily innocence can be destroyed. It also changed how I saw responsibility. The idea that everyone assumed someone else would step in is terrifying. It forces you to ask yourself what you would do in that situation. Would you act or would you freeze? Would you convince yourself it wasn't your place? Those questions are uncomfortable, but unavoidable when you think about Daniel. The grief his family endured was not just personal, it was public. Their pain became something the whole country watched unfold. And yet, no amount of attention, no arrest, no confession could ever undo what was done. Justice, in this case, could never truly exist. There is no punishment that balances the loss of a child. What stays with me most is the sheer normality of how it began. A boy walking to a bus stop, Christmas approaching, parents expecting him home later that day, a future that was supposed to stretch out in front of him. All of it erased for no reason at all. Even now, years later, Daniel Morecambe's story feels heavy in a way that never fully fades. It's not just a true crime case or a tragic headline. It's a reminder of how close evil can be, how it can live in familiar places, pass through ordinary streets, and leave scars that last generations. It's a reminder of the importance of stepping in, of paying attention, of not assuming someone else will do the right thing. Most of all, it's a reminder of a boy who should still be alive. Every time I think about Daniel, I think about his parents, his twin brother, and the life he never got to live. I think about how senseless and cruel it all was, and how unfair it feels that the world kept moving after he was gone. There is no lesson that makes it okay, no explanation that softens it. It was simply an act of pure, unnecessary evil, and that is what makes it so hard to live with. This story didn't happen to me directly. It comes from my mother, but the way she told it stayed with me so strongly that it feels almost like a memory of my own. Even now, when she brings it up, her voice changes slightly, like she's stepping back into that classroom again. It's one of those moments that never really leaves you, no matter how much time passes. When my mother was in high school, she had a science teacher who, for most of her time there, seemed completely normal. For the last couple of years, my mom had been in that school. This teacher was just another face in front of the classroom, not especially strict, not especially friendly, just average. She taught the lessons, gave out assignments, corrected tests. Nothing about her stood out as strange or concerning. My mother never described her as odd, unstable, nor unusual in any way. If anything, she blended in with the rest of the staff. The kind of teacher you forget about once the class ends. The kind of adult you trust simply because they're standing at the front of the room with authority and experience. That's what makes what happened so unsettling. One day, during a regular science lesson, the teacher was talking about lightning. It wasn't a special lecture. There was no warning that anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. Students were sitting at their desks, notebooks open, half listening in the way teenagers often do. Some were paying attention, some were bored, some were thinking about lunch or the weekend, just another school day. Then the teacher said something that caught my mother's attention. She told the class that lightning comes from the ground. That immediately confused my mom. Even as a teenager, she knew that wasn't right. Lightning is commonly understood to come from the sky, from clouds, from electrical charges building up above. Hearing a science teacher say the opposite didn't make sense. My mom didn't argue. She didn't laugh. She didn't challenge her aggressively. She simply raised her hand and asked a question. She asked the teacher to explain. That should have been the end of it. A simple clarification. Maybe a poorly worded statement. Maybe a misunderstanding. Teachers make mistakes. Students ask questions. That's how learning works. But instead of explaining calmly, the teacher replied with words that no one in that classroom was prepared to hear. She said, "Watch, I'll show you." At first, the class thought she meant a demonstration, maybe an experiment. Maybe a diagram, something visual to help explain her point. No one expected what happened next. Without saying anything else, the teacher got out from behind her desk. She walked to the front of the classroom. Then she got down on her hands and knees. Right there, in front of everyone. The room went completely silent. Students stared, confused, trying to process what they were seeing. This wasn't part of any normal lesson. Teachers don't crawl on the floor. Teachers don't act like this. There was a strange pause where no one knew how to react. No one laughed. No one spoke. It felt wrong, but no one yet understood how wrong it was about to become. Then she started smashing her head on the ground. At first, it didn't seem real. My mom said it was like watching something that didn't fit into reality. The movement was sudden and violent. Her head hit the floor hard, once, then again, and again. The sound echoed through the room. Desks scraped as students pushed back instinctively. Some froze completely. Others stood up without realizing they were doing it. A few screamed. Most just stared, unable to understand what they were witnessing. For a couple of seconds, no one moved. Shock has a way of doing that. It locks you in place. Your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing, so your body doesn't respond the way it should. Then it got worse. Blood started to appear. My mom said it wasn't immediate. At first, it was just the sound and the motion. But then there were visible signs that something was seriously wrong. Blood on the floor, blood on her face, pieces of skin, something that looked like bits of tissue. That's when panic exploded. Students screamed. Someone shouted for help. Chairs fell over as kids rushed forward. A group of students finally snapped out of the shock and grabbed the teacher, trying to restrain her. They held her arms, pulled her away from the floor, trying desperately to stop her from hurting herself further. The room was chaos. Teenagers crying, others shaking, some running out of the classroom to get help, someone pounding on the door, someone else yelling for another teacher. The smell of blood in the air, the sound of sobbing mixed with shouting. This wasn't a lesson anymore. It was an emergency. Eventually, adults arrived. Other teachers, school staff. Someone called for medical help. My mother doesn't remember every detail of what happened after that. Trauma has a way of blurring the edges. What she remembers clearly is the moment itself, the shock of it, the feeling that something had broken in a way that could never be repaired. The teacher was taken away, and that was it. My mother told me she never heard of that teacher ever again. No updates, no explanation, no announcement. One day she was there, teaching science like any other day. The next, she was gone. Her name stopped appearing on schedules. Someone else took over the class. School continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that stayed with every student who witnessed it. My mom said that after that day, the classroom never felt the same. Even when a new teacher stood at the front, even when lessons returned to normal, there was an invisible weight in the room. A shared memory no one wanted to talk about, but no one could forget. As a teenager, my mother didn't fully understand what she had seen. She knew it was horrifying. She knew it was wrong. But she didn't have the language yet to describe mental illness, breakdowns, or psychosis. All she knew was that an adult she trusted had suddenly lost control in a way that felt terrifying and unpredictable. As an adult, she understands more. She understands that the teacher was likely suffering from something serious, that whatever was happening in her mind had reached a breaking point, that the classroom wasn't the cause, just the place where it finally surfaced. But understanding doesn't make the memory easier. If anything, it makes it heavier, because it forces you to confront how fragile the line between normal and not normal really is. How someone can appear fine for years, functioning, teaching, living their life, and then suddenly unravel in front of dozens of children. My mother has said that moment changed the way she saw authority figures forever. Teachers, adults, people who were supposed to be stable and in control. After that day, she realized that being older didn't mean being immune to breaking, that someone could stand in front of a classroom one day and completely lose themselves the next. It also changed how she understood danger. There was no warning, no buildup, no signs that the day would end the way it did. It wasn't a dark hallway or a bad neighborhood. It was a bright classroom in the middle of a school day, the kind of place where you're supposed to feel safe. That's what makes the memory so disturbing. The violence wasn't directed at anyone else, but that doesn't make it less traumatic. Watching someone destroy themselves in front of you leaves a mark, especially when you're young. especially when you're not prepared to understand it. Even now, when my mom tells the story, she pauses at certain parts. She still remembers the sound, the look on the other students' faces, the moment when shock turned into panic. She remembers thinking that this couldn't be happening, that adults weren't supposed to act like this. She also remembers how quiet everything felt afterward. Not just that day, but for a long time after. A kind of silence that follows something too big to talk about. The school didn't address it openly. Parents weren't given detailed explanations. Life just moved on because that's what institutions do. But the students carried it with them. Years later, my mom still wonders what happened to that teacher, whether she survived, whether she got help, whether anyone noticed the signs before it reached that point, whether anyone could have stopped it. There are no answers, just the memory and the unsettling truth that sometimes the scariest moments aren't planned. They aren't intentional. They aren't even malicious. They're the result of a mind breaking under pressure in a place where no one expects it. That story has stayed with me too, even though I wasn't there. It's made me think about how many people around us are holding things together by sheer force of will. How many cracks go unnoticed because everything looks fine on the surface. It's easy to think of danger as something external, a stranger, a crime, a threat you can point to. But this story reminds me that danger can also come from within, from minds that are struggling silently until they can't anymore. And sometimes it happens in the most ordinary places, a classroom, a lesson, a simple question, and then in a moment, everything changes. I come from a small town in Ireland, the kind of place where nothing much ever happens and everyone knows everyone else. Crime was rare, almost unheard of, and when something did happen, it usually involved minor things like arguments outside a pub or someone getting caught stealing from a shop. The neighboring town where this story takes place was even smaller than mine. It was quieter, more close-knit, and felt even more removed from the kind of violence you only ever expected to hear about on the news, somewhere far away. That is part of what made this event so shocking. People still talk about it years later, and even now it feels strange to think something so brutal could happen in a place like that. This story goes back to one morning in 2014. Details may vary depending on who you ask, because in towns this small, stories get retold over and over again, sometimes changing slightly each time. But this is the version I know, the one that has stayed with me and with so many others who heard about it when it first happened. The victims were an elderly couple, both in their 70s. They had lived in that town for years and were well known in the community. They were retired by then, but people still remembered them clearly. The husband had been a math teacher, the kind who was known for being patient and calm, someone who took time with students who struggled. The wife had been a nurse, and my own father had worked with her on several occasions over the years. He always said she was a genuinely kind person, the sort of nurse who made patients feel safe just by being in the room. Together, they were known as a lovely couple, quiet, polite, friendly, the kind of people you'd stop and chat with if you passed them on the street. They had 2 sons. One of them lived a normal life, had a job, and kept in touch with his parents regularly. The other son was more troubled, though at the time, not everyone knew how bad things really were. On that morning in 2014, that troubled son took a hatchet and murdered both of his parents inside their own home. Even writing that sentence still feels unreal. It wasn't an argument that got out of hand or some sudden burst of rage. What he did was deliberate, violent, and beyond anything people in that town could comprehend. According to what later came out, the attack was brutal. The parents were killed inside the house, and the injuries were horrific. People who later learned the details said the bodies were so badly damaged that parts of them were almost unrecognizable. There were multiple wounds, blood everywhere, and signs of extreme violence. Some reports said there was partial decapitation. It wasn't a quick or accidental death. It was something that clearly took time and effort, which only made it more disturbing. After killing them, the son didn't stay at the house. Instead, he locked the doors and left, as if trying to seal whatever horror he had just committed inside. He then went to his brother's engineering company. This detail has always stuck with people because of how calm and strange it sounded. He walked into the workplace and handed his wallet to an employee. He reportedly said something along the lines of, "I won't be needing that." To anyone hearing that later, those words feel chilling, especially knowing what he had already done. After that, he fled. Exactly what happened next has been told in a few different ways. Some versions say that builders eventually found the bodies when they noticed something was wrong. Other versions say the couple's other son went to visit his parents later, completely unaware of what had happened inside the house. In that version, he knocked on the door, but got no answer. He knew they were home, which immediately felt strange. When he couldn't get inside, he went around to the kitchen window and noticed it was open. He climbed in, expecting maybe to find them hurt or unwell, but nothing could have prepared him for what he actually saw. What he found inside the house was beyond horrific. The scene was covered in blood. Both of his parents had suffered multiple wounds, and the damage to their bodies was extreme. It was clear they hadn't died peacefully or quickly. The shock of discovering something like that, especially when it's your own parents, is something most people can't even imagine. That image became one of the most talked about and disturbing parts of the story, even though many people wished they had never heard the details at all. News of what happened spread rapidly through the town and then to surrounding areas. For communities that were used to calm, predictable lives, it felt like reality had cracked open. People were scared, confused, and deeply saddened. Many couldn't understand how a man could do something like that to his own parents, especially parents who were known to be kind and loving. Others began to ask questions about his mental state and whether there had been warning signs that were missed. The man was eventually tracked down and arrested sometime after fleeing. When he was taken into custody, more information about his mental health began to emerge. During the investigation and later during the trial, it became clear that he was not living in the same reality as everyone else. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that can completely distort a person's perception of the world. During the trial, doctors and experts explained what had been going on inside his mind at the time of the killings. He believed that his mother was trying to poison him. He believed that people around him were conspiring against him. He believed that aliens were going to take him to the Matrix, as if his life was part of some larger, unreal system. He also believed that the IRA was trying to recruit him. These beliefs weren't just passing thoughts or fears. To him, they were real, solid truths. One of the most unsettling details was what he believed happened the night before the murders. According to testimony, he believed he heard his mother asking him to kill her and his father. In his mind, this wasn't a violent act. He believed that killing them would send them to heaven. That belief alone shows just how disconnected from reality he was at the time. To him, what he was doing may have felt like an act of mercy or obedience rather than murder. Because of his mental state, he was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. That decision was difficult for many people to accept emotionally, even if they understood it legally. For the community, it felt like there was no real sense of justice, only tragedy layered on top of tragedy. 2 elderly people lost their lives in a horrific way. One son lost his parents, and the other lost his freedom and his mind to an illness he likely didn't fully understand himself. After the trial, he was committed to the Central Mental Hospital in Dublin, where he remains. It's a secure psychiatric facility for people who have committed serious crimes while suffering from severe mental illness. Some people feel anger when they hear that he wasn't sent to a regular prison. Others feel sadness, recognizing that untreated or uncontrollable mental illness can destroy entire families. Most people feel a mix of emotions that are hard to put into words. Even years later, the story still lingers in the area. People remember the couple fondly and talk about how kind they were. They remember how shocking it was to wake up to news like that in a place where nothing like that was supposed to happen. For many, it changed how they thought about mental health, about safety, and about how well you can ever really know what is going on inside someone else's mind. For me, what makes this story so disturbing isn't just the violence, but how close to home it feels. My father had worked with the woman. People knew them. This wasn't some distant headline about strangers. This was something that happened to people who were part of the fabric of a small community. It's a reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness can exist, sometimes hidden behind familiar faces and closed doors. To this day, whenever people talk about that neighboring town, this story eventually comes up, not out of gossip, but out of disbelief. It's one of those events that marks time in a community. People remember where they were when they heard about it. They remember the silence that followed, the shock, the sadness, and they remember the elderly couple, not for how they died, but for who they were before that terrible morning in 2014. I'm 16 now, but this happened when I was much younger, probably around 7 or 8 years old. Even though so much time has passed, the memory of that night is still incredibly clear in my mind. It's one of those moments that never really fades, no matter how hard you try to forget it. I can still remember exactly how the room looked, how the air felt, and most of all, how terrified I was. It was late at night, well past the time I was supposed to be asleep. I had an Xbox Classic in my room back then, and like a lot of kids, I loved staying up late playing games whenever I could get away with it. That night, I was completely absorbed in what I was playing, not really paying attention to the time. Eventually, I glanced at the clock and realized it was around 2 in the morning. The house was completely silent, the kind of silence that only happens when everyone is deeply asleep. I knew if I stayed up any longer, I'd regret it the next day, so I decided it was finally time to go to bed. I switched off my Xbox and then turned off the lights in my room. As soon as the screen went dark, the room felt different. It always did after the lights were off, but that night it felt heavier somehow, like the darkness pressed in closer than usual. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up, settling in and trying to relax. For a few seconds, everything was quiet, and I started to drift towards sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable. It was so faint that I wasn't even sure it was real. It sounded like a whisper, but distant, like it was coming from far away. The best way I can describe it is like sitting in a classroom when the teacher is talking, and you hear your classmates whispering quietly to each other somewhere behind you. You can't make out what they're saying, but you know they're whispering. That's exactly what it sounded like. I froze in my bed, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the house settling or my imagination playing tricks on me. I lay there completely still, barely even breathing, trying to listen. After a few moments, I heard it again. This time, it was clearer, still quiet, still a whisper, but closer than before. Fear started creeping in. I knew everyone in the house was asleep. My parents always locked their bedroom door at night, and I could hear absolutely no movement anywhere else. The house was still, too still. I remember thinking about how late it was, how dark my room felt, and how wrong that whisper sounded. It didn't sound like the TV or the wind or pipes in the walls. It sounded like a voice. I pulled the covers up over my head, leaving only a tiny bit of space so I could breathe. I hoped that if I hid under the blanket, whatever was happening would stop. For a few seconds, there was silence again, and I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it again. This time, there was no doubt. The whisper was clear, steady, and unmistakable. It was repeating the same phrase over and over again. It said, "Come into the living room." The words sent a shock through my entire body. I felt my stomach drop and my chest tighten. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that I knew exactly what it was saying. I squeezed my eyes shut under the covers, my hands shaking, hoping it would stop. Instead, it kept repeating the words, "Come into the living room," over and over again, in the same quiet whisper. Each time I heard it, it sounded closer. At first, it felt like it was coming from somewhere down the hallway. Then it sounded like it was right outside my bedroom door. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might give me away, like whatever was whispering could hear it too. I tried to tell myself that I was dreaming, but I knew I wasn't. I had just turned off my game. I hadn't even closed my eyes yet. I was wide awake. The whisper didn't stop. It just kept going, calm and persistent, like it was waiting for me to respond. With every repetition, it felt like it moved closer and closer, until eventually it felt like someone was right beside my bed. Then it felt like the whisper was coming from right next to my head. The last time I heard it, it felt like the voice was whispering directly into my ear. That was when I completely lost it. I sat straight up in bed and screamed at the top of my lungs. It wasn't a normal scream. It was pure panic, the kind that comes from being absolutely terrified and not knowing what else to do. My scream echoed through the house, breaking the silence. Almost immediately, I heard my parents' bedroom door open and footsteps rush down the hallway. My mom came running into my room and turned on the light. As soon as the room filled with light, the feeling changed. The whisper was gone. The darkness pulled back into the corners like nothing had ever been there. I was shaking uncontrollably, crying and trying to explain what had happened, even though the words were coming out jumbled and rushed. My mom sat on the edge of my bed and held me, telling me everything was okay, that I was safe. She assumed I had a nightmare or scared myself by staying up too late. I tried to explain that I wasn't asleep, that I heard a voice, but I don't think she fully understood how real it felt to me. Still, she stayed with me until I calmed down and eventually fell asleep with the light on. Even after that night, I never felt fully comfortable in that house again. There was always this strange feeling like I was being watched, especially when I was alone or when the house was quiet at night. I could never explain it properly, but it felt like there was a presence there, something unseen but aware. I didn't hear the whisper again, but the memory of it stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. Sometime later, my mom and I were talking about that night. I don't remember how the conversation came up, but she ended up telling me something that made my blood run cold. She told me that before we lived in that house, the previous owner had died there. Not only that, but he had died in the living room. Apparently, he had been lying there for a while before anyone found him. She said the scene was so bad that they practically had to scrape him off the floor. When she told me that, I felt chills run all over my body. My heart started racing again, just like it had that night. The words the voice had whispered came rushing back into my head. "Come into the living room." Knowing what I knew then, those words felt even more horrifying. It felt like whatever had whispered to me that night wanted me to go to the exact place where that man had died. I didn't say much after that. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, trying to process everything. part of me wanted to believe it was all just a coincidence, that my mind had somehow connected things that didn't belong together. But another part of me, the part that remembered how real that voice sounded and how close it felt, couldn't ignore it. Even now, years later, that experience still sticks with me. I can still hear the whisper in my head sometimes, still feel that sudden rush of fear. I've had other strange experiences since then too, things I can't fully explain, and they've only made me more certain that something was wrong in that house. Whatever it was, it felt real to me. It didn't feel like imagination or a dream. It felt like something trying to reach out. I've always believed that some places hold on to things that happen inside them, especially when those things are dark or sudden or lonely. That house never felt empty, even when no one else was around. And that night, when I was just a kid, lying in bed after playing games, it felt like something in that house noticed me. It felt like it wanted my attention. I still don't know exactly what whispered to me that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. All I know is that the fear I felt was real, and it's something I'll probably carry with me for the rest of my life. And that wasn't the only strange thing that ever happened to me. I've had plenty more experiences with the paranormal since then, each one just as unsettling, and each one reminding me that some things exist whether we believe in them or not. One time, my mom and I were getting ready to go out for lunch. Just a normal day with nothing unusual planned. We live in a small, quiet place, and at the time, we had 2 dogs. One of them weighed around 100 pounds, and the other was about 50 pounds, so these were not small dogs by any means. They weren't the kind of dogs that could easily disappear without someone noticing. Before we left, my mom asked me to let them outside so they could play and use the bathroom while we were gone. That was a normal routine for us, something we had done countless times before. I clearly remember opening the door and letting them out into the backyard. We were gone for about an hour. When we got back home and pulled into the driveway, the first thing we noticed was how quiet it was outside. Usually, at least one of the dogs would come running up to the fence or bark when they heard the car. That didn't happen. I remember feeling a small sense of confusion at first, but nothing close to fear yet. My first thought was that maybe I had made a mistake and hadn't actually let them outside, so we went into the house to check. Our house is a single-story place, around 1,000 square feet, so it's not very big at all. There aren't many places for 2 large dogs to hide without being seen. We walked through every room, calling their names, expecting to hear paws or see tails wagging. Nothing, no movement, no sound. That's when things started to feel strange. If they weren't inside, then maybe they really were outside and just didn't feel like coming when called. I went back out into the backyard and started searching. Our yard has plenty of places where dogs could hang out. We have 2 sheds, a lot of trees, and a fenced-off section we call the squirrel yard. We used to have a pet squirrel, which is how it got the name, but at the time it was just another area the dogs could access. I walked around calling for them, checking behind sheds, between trees, and in every corner of the yard. There was no sign of them anywhere. It was like they had vanished. That's when the worry really kicked in. We started thinking about the possibility that the dogs had somehow escaped. Our yard is surrounded by a 6-foot privacy fence, so they couldn't jump it. Still, they had dug holes under the fence in the past, so that was the next thing we checked. We walked the entire perimeter of the yard, inspecting every inch of the fence line. There were no holes, not even a small one. There was absolutely no way either of those dogs could have squeezed under the fence without leaving clear evidence. Once we ruled that out, our thoughts went somewhere even darker. We wondered if someone had stolen our dogs. Our larger dog looked like a pit bull mix, and sadly that kind of dog can be targeted for awful reasons like dog fighting. Maybe someone took one and grabbed the other too, but the more we thought about it, the less sense it made. Our fence gate was padlocked, and the locks were still exactly as we had left them. No damage, no signs of tampering. For someone to steal the dogs, they would have had to climb a tall privacy fence, somehow lift two heavy dogs over it, and leave without making a sound or leaving a trace. It felt impossible. Next, we checked all the locks on the house. Every door was locked. Every window was shut and secure. Nothing was broken or disturbed. Still, part of me wondered if the dogs had somehow gotten back inside on their own and were hiding. So we searched again, even more thoroughly. We looked under beds, inside closets, behind furniture, and even in rooms that were usually closed off. There was nowhere left to check. Desperate and confused, I decided to check one last place. I went outside and removed the grate covering the crawl space under the house. I crawled underneath, getting dirty and uncomfortable, shining a light around to see if they had somehow gotten down there. They weren't there either. At that point, we were running out of explanations. Our final idea was to search the neighborhood. Even though there was no logical way they could have gotten out, we didn't know what else to do. We locked up the house again and started walking around, calling their names, asking neighbors if they had seen our dogs. No one had. There were no sightings, no sounds, no clues at all. It was like they had never existed. After about an hour of searching, we went back home to figure out our next step. We were exhausted, stressed, and completely confused. I was about to head back to the crawl space to check one more time when I suddenly heard my mom shouting my name. There was something in her voice that made my heart jump. I ran inside, not knowing what to expect. There they were. Both dogs were inside the house, lying in their beds, sound asleep. They looked peaceful, comfortable, and completely unharmed, as if they had been there the entire time. I just stood there, staring at them, trying to understand what I was seeing. No one else had keys to our house. No locks were broken. All the windows were still shut and locked. There was no logical way for those dogs to have left the property, vanished for hours, and then somehow reappeared inside the house. What made it even stranger was how calm they were. One of our dogs is scared of absolutely everything. Loud noises, strangers, sudden movements, anything at all will usually make him anxious. If something had happened to them, if they had escaped or been taken or even just gotten lost, he would have been freaking out. But he wasn't. He was sleeping like nothing unusual had occurred. The entire ordeal took place over roughly 3 hours. 3 hours of searching, panic, and confusion, followed by a moment that made absolutely no sense. To this day, my mom and I still talk about it, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. We've gone over every possibility again and again, and none of them add up. There is no logical reason for how our dogs disappeared and then suddenly reappeared inside our locked home. No evidence, no damage, no signs of stress or fear in the dogs themselves. Just a gap in time that neither of us can explain. And even now, thinking about it still gives me an uneasy feeling, because sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones that happen quietly, without leaving any trace behind at all. My best friend is 40 years old now, but this story goes back to when we were teenagers, back when none of us really understood how fragile safety can be, or how close ordinary life can come to something truly horrifying. It is one of those stories that stayed buried for years and only became heavier with time, once the truth finally came out. Back in high school, my best friend lived with his parents and his younger sister in a quiet suburban area. It was the kind of neighborhood where people felt comfortable letting their kids walk places, where neighbors knew each other, and where serious crime felt distant, like something that happened somewhere else. His sister was about 16 or 17 at the time. She was social, excited about parties, and eager to enjoy her teenage years like everyone else. One night, there was a party happening in town. It was nothing unusual, just the kind of gathering that spreads by word of mouth among teenagers. My friend's parents were cautious, but not overly strict. They agreed to let his sister go on one condition. Her brother was supposed to walk her there and walk her back home afterward. It was a short walk, and they believed it would be safer if she wasn't alone. Normally, that might have happened without any issue, but at that moment in their lives, my friend and his sister were not getting along at all. They were in the middle of a serious argument, the kind that feels enormous when you're young. Harsh words had been exchanged. Pride and anger had taken over. When his parents told him he needed to walk his sister to the party, he flat out refused. He didn't want to help her. He didn't want to talk to her. He didn't want to be around her at all. His parents were upset. They argued with him and tried to reason with him, but they didn't force the issue. They assumed she would be fine. It was a familiar route. The town felt safe. They had no reason to believe anything bad would happen. Eventually, his sister left the house alone and headed toward the party. The party itself was uneventful. She spent time with friends, laughed, talked, and enjoyed herself. When it was time to leave, she didn't want to walk home by herself, especially in the dark. By chance, she ran into a friend who was also heading in the same direction. Relieved, she asked if they could walk together, and the friend agreed. It felt like a small stroke of luck, something that made the walk home feel normal and safe again. They were walking along the road, talking casually, when a brown Chevy Camaro slowed down beside them. The car pulled close enough that they could see the driver clearly. He rolled down the window and asked the girl if she wanted a ride. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to make her uncomfortable. She politely said no, that she was fine. The car didn't drive away. Instead, the driver asked again. He insisted. He pressed the offer, lingering in a way that made the situation feel wrong. Alarm bells started ringing. The friend walking her home stepped in and firmly told the driver to leave them alone and go away. There was tension in the air, a moment where no one knew what might happen next. Thankfully, the car finally drove off. They stood there for a second, shaken, before continuing the rest of the way home. When she arrived safely, her heart was still racing. She went inside and immediately told her family what had happened. She described the car. She described how the man wouldn't take no for an answer. Her parents were disturbed, but again, they tried to reassure themselves that nothing had actually happened. She was home safe. It was over. My friend, still angry and stubborn, barely reacted at all. He brushed it off. He didn't think much of it. At that age, it was easy to believe that bad things happened to other people, not to your own family. He went on with his life, and the incident slowly faded into the background. Years passed. School ended. Life moved forward. My friend grew up, got older, built a life, and rarely thought about that night. His sister grew up too. On the surface, it became just another forgotten moment from their teenage years. But then the news started to come out. Police began arresting and charging a man connected to a series of brutal rapes and murders in the Scarborough area. The details were disturbing. Young women, abductions, violence. The case shocked the entire region. As more information was released, one detail stood out in a way that made my friend's blood run cold. The suspect drove a brown Chevy Camaro. As the investigation continued, the name Paul Bernardo became known everywhere. His crimes were horrifying beyond words. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a predator who actively hunted young women, often approaching them in seemingly normal ways before attacking. When my friend realized the timeline, the location, and the description of the car all matched that night. From years earlier, everything clicked into place. The man who had pulled up beside his sister and tried to get her into his car was almost certainly Paul Bernardo. That realization hit him like a punch to the chest. Suddenly, that old memory was no longer harmless. It wasn't just an awkward encounter. It was a near miss with one of the most dangerous men in Canadian history. His sister hadn't just been uncomfortable. She had been seconds, maybe moments, away from being abducted, assaulted, and possibly killed. And the only reason she wasn't was because she hadn't walked home alone. The guilt that followed was overwhelming. My friend replayed that night over and over in his head. He thought about his refusal. He thought about his anger. He thought about how easily he could have walked with her, how simple it would have been to put aside the fight for just a few minutes. Instead, his pride had mattered more than her safety. He imagined what could have happened if she hadn't run into a friend. He imagined her alone on the road, tired, distracted, and vulnerable. He imagined her accepting the ride just to get home faster. The thought made him sick. For years, he carried that guilt silently. It changed how he saw himself. It changed how he thought about responsibility, about family, about the consequences of small decisions. He knew that nothing bad had happened, but that didn't make the realization any easier to live with. In some ways, it made it harder. The fact that disaster had come so close without actually happening left him trapped in a loop of what if. What if the friend hadn't been there? What if the driver had been more aggressive? What if she had felt pressured into the car? What if that argument had never happened? There was no way to rewrite the past, only to live with the knowledge of how fragile that moment had been. His sister eventually learned more details about the case as well. She understood just how close she had come to something unimaginable. It shook her deeply, but she also felt grateful in a way that was hard to explain. Grateful for chance, grateful for timing, grateful for a friend who spoke up when something felt wrong. This story isn't dramatic in the way horror movies are. There were no screams, no chase, no violence that night. And yet, it is terrifying in a quieter way. It shows how evil doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes slowly, politely, in the form of a car pulling over and asking a simple question. It also shows how ordinary decisions can carry life-changing weight. A sibling argument, a refusal, a short walk that didn't happen. These weren't choices made with bad intentions, but they almost led to irreversible consequences. Even now, decades later, my friend still talks about that night with a heaviness in his voice. It is a reminder that danger can exist just outside the edges of normal life, and that sometimes survival has nothing to do with strength or planning and everything to do with luck. His sister survived because of coincidence, not protection, and that knowledge is something he will carry with him for the rest of his life. I work as a gunsmith, a profession that places me at the intersection of fine machinery and the heavy weight of human history. In this trade, you quickly learn that firearms are rarely just objects of wood and steel. They carry stories, some of which are light and full of sporting tradition, while others are dark enough to leave a permanent stain on the soul of anyone who handles them. A friend and colleague of mine, who runs a reputable shop and range, has one such weapon locked away in his vault. It sits there to this day, still tucked inside an official evidence box, a sterile cardboard container that belies the absolute horror of the history contained within. My friend doesn't talk about it often, but when the shop is quiet and the air feels heavy with the scent of gun oil and lead, he looks toward that vault with a gaze that suggests he isn't just looking at a locked door, but at a cage for something that should never have been made. The story of this particular firearm began under circumstances that should have been rooted in love and a father's desire to protect his child. It was originally purchased by a police officer, a man who spent his life understanding the dangers of the world and wanted to ensure his daughter had the means to defend herself. He bought it brand new, a clean piece of engineering that had never seen a drop of blood or felt the heat of a desperate moment. He gave it to her as a gift, perhaps imagining her keeping it in a bedside drawer or carrying it in her purse for safety. But the world has a cruel way of subverting our intentions. Not long after receiving the weapon, the daughter used it to end her own life. The very tool her father had provided for her protection became the instrument of her destruction. Devastated and unable to look at the weapon that had stolen his future, the officer did what many in that position do. He brought it back to the store and sold it. He wanted it gone, thinking that by removing the physical object, he could somehow lessen the weight of the tragedy. The store owner, not yet realizing the dark path the weapon was carving, put it back into the display case as a used firearm. It didn't sit there for long. It was purchased by another individual, a person looking for a reliable used gun at a fair price. We don't know much about this second owner, only that their time with the weapon was tragically short. Within a matter of months, the cycle repeated itself. This person also used the gun to commit suicide. When the police finished their investigation, the gun once again found its way back to the market, and eventually it returned to the very same store. By this time, a sense of unease was beginning to settle among the staff. 2 owners, 2 suicides. In the world of firearms, you hear about bad luck, but this felt like something more deliberate, as if the steel itself had developed a taste for the darkness within the human heart. Hoping to break the cycle and thinking that perhaps the gun just needed to be used for its intended purpose of target practice, my friend decided to put it into the range as a rental. It was a common enough practice. Rentals get used hundreds of times a month, and the constant activity usually washes away the history of a used weapon, but the gun wasn't finished. One afternoon, a young woman rented it to practice with her boyfriend. She was wearing a low-cut shirt, a detail that seems insignificant until you understand the mechanics of a semi-automatic weapon. As she fired a round, the hot brass casing ejected from the side of the gun and in a freak occurrence bounced off the lane divider and fell straight down the front of her shirt. The searing heat of the metal against her skin caused a primitive, panicked reaction. She winced and jerked her hand, and in that split second of pain, her finger tightened on the trigger. The gun discharged, and the bullet struck her boyfriend in the leg. It wasn't fatal, but the chaos and blood on the range that day added another layer of trauma to the weapon's growing legend. Despite the accident, the gun remained in the rental fleet for a short while longer. The staff wanted to believe that the incident with the hot brass was just a 1-in-a-million fluke, a bit of bad luck that could happen with any firearm. But the final straw came not long after. A man came into the range, checked out the gun, and went into one of the far lanes. He seemed perfectly normal, just another customer looking to blow off some steam after work. He stood there for a few minutes, loading the magazine with a steady hand. Then, without warning, he turned the weapon on himself and pulled the trigger right there on the range. The sudden violence of it, occurring in a public space in front of other shooters and staff, was the breaking point. It was no longer a series of coincidences, it was a pattern of absolute horror. My friend realized then that he couldn't in good conscience sell this weapon or let anyone else touch it. He took it back, processed the evidence requirements with the police, and once the final investigation was closed, he locked it away in his vault. It has stayed there ever since, a silent prisoner in an evidence box. My friend says that even through the cardboard and the heavy steel of the vault, he can feel the presence of that gun. He describes it as a cold spot in the room, a place where the air feels thin and the light doesn't quite reach. As gunsmiths, we are taught to see firearms as machines, tools that respond only to the input of the user. But when you look at the history of a piece like that, you start to wonder if some objects can become charged with the energy of the tragedies they have facilitated. It's as if the gun has become a magnet for despair, a physical anchor for the darkest impulses of the people who hold it. It doesn't matter who the person is or what their intentions are. Once they wrap their hand around that grip, the gun begins to whisper to the shadows already living inside them. The horror of this story isn't just in the deaths themselves, but in the way the gun seems to find its way back to the store over and over again. It's like a predatory animal that knows exactly where its hunting grounds are. Each time it was sold or rented, it was done so with the hope of a fresh start, yet it always ended in blood. The cop who bought it for his daughter could never have imagined the nightmare he was initiating. The second buyer thought they were getting a deal. The woman on the range thought she was having a fun afternoon with her boyfriend, and the final man saw it as his last exit. The gun was the common thread, a cold, unfeeling witness to the end of 4 lives and the wounding of a 5th. It makes you realize that in our line of work, we aren't just fixing machines, we are handling the artifacts of human tragedy. I often think about the mechanics of that gun, wondering if there's some subtle flaw in the sear, or the trigger pull that makes it more prone to accidental discharge, or if it simply feels right in the hand of someone who is suffering. But deep down, I know the mechanics have nothing to do with it. The gun is perfectly functional, a masterpiece of modern manufacturing. That is perhaps the scariest part of all. It isn't a broken thing. It is a thing that does exactly what it was designed to do, but it does it with a frequency and a context that defies logic. It has become a cursed object in the truest sense of the word, a vessel for a specific kind of misery that doesn't want to be forgotten. The vault where it sits is a place of heavy silence. My friend doesn't open the evidence box anymore. He doesn't want to see the serial number or feel the coldness of the slide. He just wants it to stay buried, a secret kept behind thick layers of steel and security. He's been offered money for it by people who collect notorious items, individuals who find a sick fascination in the history of such things, but he refuses to sell it. He knows that if that gun ever left his shop, it would only be a matter of time before another police report was filed and another family was shattered. He sees himself as a guardian, a man who is sacrificing a bit of his own peace of mind to ensure that the cycle of the gun is finally broken. The fucked up reality of this weapon is something that stays with me as I work on other firearms. I find myself looking at a customer's revolver or a hunter's rifle and wondering what its story will be 10 or 20 years from now. Most guns live long, quiet lives, passed down through generations as cherished family heirlooms. They are used for target practice, for hunting, or for the simple peace of mind of home defense. But some are born under a dark star, or perhaps they encounter a tragedy so profound that it alters their very nature. The gun in the vault is the ultimate example of this. It is a piece of hardware that has been overwritten by horror, a tool that has become a weapon against the very people it was meant to serve. I remember my friend telling me about the day the woman shot her boyfriend. He said the scream she let out when the hot brass hit her was nothing compared to the scream she let out when she realized she had pulled the trigger. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock, the realization that her body had betrayed her in the worst way possible. The gun didn't care about her wince or her panic. It just waited for the pressure on the trigger. That incident, while not a suicide, was perhaps the most telling of all. It showed that the gun didn't need a willing participant to cause harm. It just needed a moment of vulnerability. It was as if the weapon was reaching out, looking for any excuse to discharge and continue its bloody legacy. The final man, the one who ended it on the range, is the one who haunts the staff the most. They had seen him walk in, talked to him, and handed him the weapon with a smile and a "have a good session." They provided the very means for his end, and the guilt of that is something that doesn't just go away. The range is supposed to be a place of discipline and skill, a controlled environment where safety is the highest priority. But the gun turned it into a crime scene, a place of trauma for everyone who was there that day. It violated the sanctuary of the shop, proving that no amount of rules or supervision can stop something that is determined to happen. We often talk about negative energy in a way that feels a bit abstract. But when you spend your life around firearms, you start to see it as something tangible. It's the weight of the steel, the smell of the gunpowder, and the history of the hands that have held the weapon. The gun in the vault has an energy so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. It's a presence that demands your attention, a silent scream that echoes through the shop even when the doors are locked and the lights are off. My friend says he sometimes dreams about the gun, imagining it sitting in the box, the metal slowly pulsing with a dark rhythmic light. It's a dream that always leaves him waking up in a cold sweat, reaching for his own bedside weapon just to feel a sense of control. I wonder what will happen to that gun when my friend eventually retires, or if he ever decides to close the shop. It's a liability in every sense of the word, a piece of evidence that is no longer needed but is too dangerous to release. I've suggested that he should take it to a deep part of the ocean and drop it over the side, or perhaps take it to a foundry and watch it be melted down into a harmless lump of iron. But there's a part of him that is afraid to even move it. He feels that as long as it's in the vault, he knows where it is. He knows it's contained. If he tries to dispose of it, he's afraid it might find a way to stay, or that the act of moving it might trigger one last act of violence. It sounds irrational, I know, but when you've seen what that gun can do, rationality is the first thing to go out the window. The story is a reminder that the tools we create are only as good as the world they inhabit. In a world of pain and desperation, a gun can become a focal point for all of it. It doesn't have a soul, but it can certainly feel like it has a will. The cop's daughter, the used buyer, the woman on the range, and the man at the end. They are all part of the gun's history now, their lives forever linked by a serial number and a piece of forged steel. It is a specialized kind of horror, the realization that an object can be so thoroughly corrupted by its past that it loses its original purpose and becomes something else entirely. It is a monument to the fragility of human life and the devastating power of a single moment of despair. I find myself thinking about the cop who originally bought it. I wonder if he ever found out what happened to the gun after he sold it. I wonder if he knows that his gift continued to take lives long after he walked away from it. I hope for his sake that he doesn't. Some burdens are too heavy for any one person to carry, and the knowledge that your attempt to protect your child led to a decade of death is a weight that would crush the strongest man. He thought he was doing the right thing, and that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and in this case, it was also paved with the brass casings of a cursed gun. The vault is still there, and the evidence box is still sitting on the top shelf, tucked away in the back where the light doesn't reach. My friend continues his work, fixing rifles and cleaning pistols, always with a professional eye and a steady hand. But he never goes into that vault alone. He always makes sure someone else is in the shop. A bit of light to counter the darkness he knows is waiting behind that heavy steel door. He is a man who has looked into the abyss and decided to be the one who keeps it closed. He is a gunsmith, a guardian, and a witness to a story that should never have been told. The horror of the gun isn't a ghost story in the traditional sense. It's a story about the reality of the items we live with every day. It's about the way the past can cling to the present, and how a machine can become a vessel for the worst parts of our nature. We like to think we are in control of our tools, but the story of the gun in the vault suggests that sometimes the tools are in control of us. It is a fucked up legacy, a dark chain of events that reminds us to be careful with the power we wield and even more careful with the things we choose to bring into our homes. The gun is silent now, but its silence is a heavy, expectant thing, a reminder that the darkness is always there, waiting for the next person to turn the key. The next time you walk into a gun shop or stand on a firing range, take a look at the weapons on the wall. Think about the hands that have held them and the stories they might carry. Most of them are just tools, but every once in a while you might come across one that feels a bit colder than the rest. You might see a serial number that makes the hair on your arms stand up. If you do, trust your instincts. Some things aren't meant to be handled, and some stories are better left behind a locked door. My friend knows this better than anyone, and he keeps his vault closed for a reason. He is the keeper of the gun, and he will be until the day he can finally find a way to let it go without letting the horror out. The world continues to turn, and the memories of the people who died by that gun are slowly fading into the history of the town. But for my friend and me, the story is as fresh as a new scratch on a polished slide. We are the keepers of the mechanics and the memories, the ones who know the truth behind the steel. We will continue to do our jobs, to provide safety and skill to the people who seek it, but we will always have one eye on the vault. We will always remember the girl, the man, the accident, and the final breath on the range. We will remember the gun, and we will make sure it stays exactly where it belongs, in the dark, in the box, and far away from the light of day. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.